So our plan is that we're going to, I'm going to provide a little bit of framing to the conversation, why do we think this conversation is an important one to have. Then we're going to break down into 3 individual case studies. And then we're going to invite our audience and colleagues to contribute to a broader discussion Q&A in hopes that that will, draw out from the localized practicalities of our individual institutions to think about some bigger, broader trends. First of all, I want to thank you and thank Nancy Adams and everyone else at the Library Publishing Coalition who have made this work. I just want to add our thanks. We've really appreciated it. It seems that it has run very smoothly, and I've learned a lot already. So in introducing the session, I'm going to show a couple of slides, or a few slides. So I'm going to share my screen and try to make that the most important thing here. Can you see my screen? Yep. Can you see my screen?
No,
not yet.
do you have the now we can see it.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So I will leave that up the whole time I'm talking until I'm done with slides, and then that way we won't have to be So as many of you know, in recent years, there's been an upward trend of university presses restructuring within their university library. According to data compiled by AU Presses in 2019, the directors of 29 member presses reported to the head of libraries. That's the slide you're seeing here. So you can see this upward trajectory. With 22% of member presses integrated within libraries, the press library model is actually now the 2nd most common reporting structure for university presses. In fact, if we consider only member presses who are part of a university system, of course, some members of AU presses are museums, institutions, and other nonprofits, the percentage rises to actually closer to 30%, putting it, in steep competition for reporting to the chief academic officer as the most common reporting structure. Press library mergers have been the focus of debate for some time, in part because financial exigencies are often the impetus for moving the press under the library's umbrella. So naturally, some have argued that the business model of a press conflicts with the commitment of libraries to free and open access. Others have argued that a true marriage between a press and a library aligns the mission between these two parties, with press personnel contributing to scholarly communication support and collaborating on open access initiatives. In actual practice, there really is no one-size-fits-all model for any press in terms of reporting structure. In fact, there are a lot of variables, including institutional context, the press's size. For instance, Clemson is relatively small, and a host of other factors, really, that determine what the most logical reporting structure is. In fact, the ongoing debate about press and library integration emphasizes the reporting structure at the expense of other factors that we think also bear on the level of integration possible for a press within a library. Through these 3 case studies that we're going to present, we're going to examine how another aspect of organizational structure, namely the classification of press personnel as faculty, staff, professional faculty, administrative staff, and then all the many various different ways that we stratify each other, bears on the level of integration between presses and libraries. Equity of status, we think, facilitates a more fully realized integration. It minimizes what some perceive as the competing interests of libraries and presses. Press directors are in a position to devote more time to open access initiatives, for instance, when career advancement and sustainability, both inside and outside the institution, aren't tied to sales. Libraries are better positioned to support scholarly communication support with a publishing expert on the team who can devote time to that. They have a shared mission. Next slide that I'm going to show you here is essentially a poll taken in 2019 of press directors who report to libraries and their deans. Of the press directors who responded to the poll, 8 are faculty, 8 are staff at institutions where librarians are faculty classified, and 5 are staff at institutions where librarians are staff classified. So just to explain that a little bit differently, essentially what we have is a situation where staff is the most common classification for press directors, but not every library has faculty and staff. So when we factor that in, there is equity. Now, when we look at these two breakdown of partial inequity and inequity, essentially what partial inequity means is that there's some particular title given to the press director within the library that permits them administrative status, they're on an advisory board, or they're on a leadership team. So the 22% with inequality are essentially staff with the same status as any other staff member in the library. So with that, we want to turn to the case studies and stop sharing. We want to turn on to the case studies to talk about why the classification matters. What are the practical implications to our individual institutions? We're going to start with Charles and then move to Lisa and then myself.
John, thank you very much indeed for that good introduction, and it's very nice to be here. So I'm Charles Watkinson. I'm Associate University Librarian for Publishing at University of Michigan, and I'm also Director of University of Michigan Press. And I think that combination of titles is still unique. So I want to talk about what that means. The press at University of Michigan Press moved into the library in 2009. The press is considered part of the publishing division of the library, of which I am head. And that publishing division consists of University of Michigan Press, Michigan Publishing Services, that used to be called the Scholarly Publishing Office. And so that's really the sort of the main entity within the Library Publishing Coalition, run by Jason Coleman. And then Deep Blue Repository and Research Data Services. And so that's the Institutional Repository and Institutional Repository Services team. So that is what the publishing division consists of. The staff in the publishing division are divided into staff and librarians in the university's classification. Most of the employees in the publishing division are classified as staff. The few people who are classified behind the scenes as librarians moved into the operation with the Scholarly Publishing Office at the time of the merger, or are part of the Deep Blue team. So we have out of about 45 staff, probably about 8 or 9 of those are librarians. And who ends up being a librarian, who ends up not being a librarian, it's really a legacy situation. It's the status they were in when they came into the publishing division and this unified entity. As director of the press and AUL, I had the fortunate experience of coming in as the most senior kind of librarian possible. So I am called librarian behind the scenes, which is super exciting for me because I have no qualifications at all in librarianship. I have no MLS, and I haven't had to climb the complex and difficult ladder of librarianship, moving up through from assistant to associate to senior associate to the lofty heights of librarian. So I do feel a bit of a fraud, but it's important that I am a librarian because as a librarian, I can supervise other librarians, including senior associates and associates. So it was kind of an administrative convenience in some ways that I should be a librarian, but it also has some rather important side effects, which I think are really important to consider, especially because I moved to Michigan from Purdue University, where I didn't have a formal library role. I was a staff member, and I didn't have a leadership role in the library. And so I'm seeing real contrasts. So in my current role, I have firstly the privilege of being a librarian, and that means that I get to access information that other librarians share. So I'm on LibrarianForum. I'm also on listservs that librarians, which would include people like subject specialists and so on, participate in. So that's the first thing. I'm a librarian, so I see a lot of information, and I can supervise other librarians. Secondly, I'm an associate university librarian, so I'm one of 4 or 5 associate university librarians. And that means that within the university structure, I'm perceived as an equivalent to an associate dean. So that means that I can participate in associate dean type research, teaching meetings without looking out of place. The reality is I actually don't have a peer group of associate deans doing similar things. But if I do need to turn up to an associate dean for research meeting, I'm not going to get kicked out. And also I'm able to collaborate on a very equal level with the other AULs. So there's an associate university librarian for learning and teaching, associate university librarian for research, collections, and operations. And it's good to be able to work on a par with those colleagues. And finally, I'm part of the top leadership of the library. So that gives me permissions, access to the dean. It gives me a ready flow of information. I've also learned since starting work remotely that it gives me a very special privilege, which is I show up as a VIP on the information technology support system. So I get answered within a minute, and I had absolutely no clue that this was happening, but it was really, really fun when it happened, because I've had lots of problems with my computer because I'm technologically illiterate. So just in general, thinking about this really important question that John and Lisa have raised of what are the implications of the statuses that university press staff hold, as well as directors, in an integrated library system? Well, firstly, something that's very special for me about the status that I have is that I'm able to represent publishing as a natural part of what a library does. And that's still, as this audience knows more than any audience, that's still quite a cultural shift. Quite often, my colleagues joke with me that there's this difference between publishing with a small p and publishing with a large P, and I blur the lines because I'm a constant irritant to them, in that I'm always talking about publishing as a natural part of the library. And I do think that publishing is a natural part of what libraries should be doing. And actually, I find it a much more compelling alternative to the term scholarly communication. And I do think we should all talk about what scholarly communication does in terms of us being publishers, and what we're doing is publishing. So that's all to say that it's really important for me to be part of the library leadership, because I can constantly be that voice of reminding everybody that publishing is a natural part of the library. When you look at the rest of the press staff, there are some real problems about the fact that they are classified generally as staff, and they are in contrast to librarians working on similar issues and in similar ways elsewhere in the organization. What's happening is that the similarities of all of us working essentially more and more with faculty as authors of information rather than faculty as just users of information, those are being obscured by these different classifications. So for example, it strikes me every day increasingly that acquisitions editors and subject specialists are doing incredibly similar things. If we could only break down the barriers between the two of those classifications, we would realize some terrific wins. Certainly we have to deal with some of the personality differences and some of the cultural differences. But if we could say, look, these are all information professionals, they're all on the same side, they're all working together, we could have these amazing synergies turning up. So we've tried to sort of seed this by sending, in the old days when we could go to conferences, sending a subject specialist and an acquisitions librarian together to a disciplinary conference and seeing what happened if we had them hanging out together and sort of working together. And we were starting to get a little bit of return on that sort of strategy. Another similarity is between technical services and production editors. So those are two very production-oriented type of work situations, but they are also very skilled. And so thinking about the similarities with how we reward those two sets of staff, for example, is very useful. But it is held back by librarians versus staff classifications. So I've preferred to really use the term information professionals as much as possible, rather than staff and librarians, and hoping by just saying it again and again and again, and saying the university press, these are information professionals, the subject specialists, these are information professionals, that this will eventually come into common understanding. And it's really important, because otherwise there's tension. So we have several staff members in the press who have MLSs, for example, and how are they different really in any way from some of their librarian colleagues? And of course, over in the rest of the library, there are a number of people now who do not have MLSs because of the specialist skills that they bring in areas like data visualization and data services. So that's our local context. I just wanted to say again, I think this is super, super important, and especially as we enter into a very, very difficult period for all of us. I think what we're going to see in the next few years is we're going to see a real fissioning of the way in which university presses identify themselves. And I think even with the list of presses reporting to libraries that John showed at the start, I think we're going to see a real division between presses who are really serious and libraries who are really serious about the idea of integration, the vision, and presses for which this was just an administrative convenience. And I think we're already starting to see a few presses moving over to other parts of the university to report to them, because separation versus integration, this is the way things are going to be forced in the coming period. So if we're serious about integration, this is the time to wrestle with these staff classifications and librarian classifications that we have inherited as legacy. Thank you.
Am I up? I am up. Thanks, Charles. I am happy to put myself in a somewhat oppositional position, in that I think having us speak back to back demonstrates being at one end of the spectrum versus being at the other end of the spectrum, given my own context. So I am the director of Wilfrid Laurier University Press. We're located in Waterloo, Ontario. We're part of a much smaller institution than the University of Michigan. And as a result, our library is much smaller. We were brought into the library. Really, I like to describe it as a kind of shotgun marriage for a courtship that was already underway, in that we had been building partnerships with the library over the years previous to our official administrative integration in 2015. We shared a position, a digital projects coordinator position, that oversaw the administration of the university's institutional repository, and on the press side undertook a lot of our metadata systems management and ebook administrative work. So that position continues to be a shared position between the press and the library. When we came in officially to the library, it was under a considerable amount of budgetary pressure. And I think that that set a particularly challenging tone for the administrative organization and administrative relationship. And I think that it has been a challenging legacy to overcome. And the kind of hangover, if you will, that that has had on what is possible in terms of the types of partnerships or productive relationships that we've been able to forge within the library, given the position of the press as an entity that needed to be rescued, in a sense, has been really challenging. That happened at the same time as the university's art gallery also came under the auspices in the reporting structure to the university library. And both of those organizational responsibilities came with no additional funding. In fact, they came with a substantive reduction in funding to each organization that was being integrated into the library. Given the position in Canada with regard to federal funding and provincial funding, support for the publishing industry. There were budgetary reasons for the press needing not only to maintain its editorial integrity as a kind of separate unit with an editorial board and all of the best practices that we're accustomed to working under in the university press community that the AUP has outlined in its various documentation, but that there had to be an independence of business decision and editorial control in order to remain eligible for a lot of those funding programs, which represent a really significant chunk of our operational budget on an annual basis. So we had a structural divide, if you will, that needed to be maintained for some very pragmatic reasons. In terms of my own reporting, my title is Director of the Press. I do not have any corresponding title or responsibility within the library. Ironically, out of the 3 press directors here, I'm the one with an MLAs. And in fact, I have taught in at my alma mater in organization of information and publishing and media for librarians. I functioned as adjunct faculty for about 5-6 years before my press responsibilities made that more of a challenge. In terms of the operational structure, we have at WLU one university librarian who is our head, 2 associate university librarians. That number and structure is specified, in fact, in the faculty collective agreement. So there is not a lot of flexibility without making substantive changes to our union negotiated arrangements for the university faculty and librarians, which are grouped. Our faculties do have a tenure structure. It's an equivalent to tenure structure called continuing status. But it is overseen by the faculty collective agreement. So in order to make a change there at the top level organization, it would require some substantive reorganization of priorities within the faculty union in order to make that happen. And it would have to happen on the negotiating schedule. The top level management of the university library consists of a library executive. That is the university librarian, 2 associate university librarians, and the chief. There's an administrative officer of the library, which is considered a professional position. So within our library, we have a breakdown of 3, actually technically 4 employment groups. The first being faculty, which all the librarians are considered, including the executive positions. There is a management group, which consists of very few individuals. That's the employment group to which my position is designated. There's a professional and administrative group, which is where the administrative officer of the library belongs. And the remaining people are all considered staff, including the remainder of the press staff. What this has meant is that, as Charles has outlined, there are restrictions similar at WLU on who librarians can report to. They can only report to another librarian. So the fact that I am not a librarian means a librarian cannot report to me, cannot be supervised by me in any capacity. This puts in place some real divides in terms of the kinds of work that librarians can take on behalf of the press in order for the press to remain operationally sound, but also for me to maintain the level of editorial control that I need to be able to report to outwards with regard to external funding bodies, et cetera, where I need to have that kind of supervisory capacity and that capacity to direct. So it has led to somewhat of an impasse. It is a bit of a struggle in how to move forward with an integration, a model of integration that does not in fact put at risk our substantive industry funding. So that has been one practical challenge that is I think perhaps unique to the Canadian situation, but may apply in other jurisdictions. I think that raises in some ways a little bit of, as Charles has spoken so much to the kind of perception of professional work and the ways in which increasingly I'm very informed by the idea of convergence culture, the way that we've seen a kind of collapse of the type of work that librarians, faculty members, offices of research are conducting across campuses. You know, we are increasingly engaging in similar types of activities in slightly different spheres, but they're coming more and more into play with one another. As we see changing structures, I think that it certainly operating in a digital environment is increasingly collapsing that as well. So the degree of, for example, research activity that I might be undertaking in my role as director, or even more problematically for us, my senior editor, who's technically a staff member, is undertaking at the same level of a faculty member, considering that we in fact both share similar qualifications to the librarians that we interact with, but have very different recognitions of professional status. That can create difficulties, for example, in discussing with the Office of Research and the services they provide, whether or not we legitimately have access to that as non-faculty members, whether that support is something that we can access. So that legitimacy, Charles, that you were talking about in terms of the position and the overall designation within the structure, the academic structure of the university, starts to become really key in the ability of the press to bring its fullest contribution to the act of making public scholarship. If we want to think about the act of publishing or the work of scholarly communications, that's what it is at its core, is making scholarship public in some kind of professional capacity. I like that idea of thinking about information professionals more broadly than just the narrow definition traditionally of the librarian position. Like you, I also have a new staff member coming in who also has an MLAs, which brings my staffing complement, a third of us now, having MLAs is not in librarian positions. And this has been a subject of serious conversation about whether or not the expectation of those individuals, myself one of them, to be engaging in quote unquote librarian work and what that means. So one of the things I have wrestled with is, do we understand this as a question of the collective agreement in terms of an understanding of organization of labor within within the specifics of our context, the university WLU, or do we understand this more broadly in an understanding of a changing nature of the profession, which is to say librarianship evolving to become more flexible in terms of its understandings of where your skill base might come from, how we understand what the work of a librarian actually is, to understand the act of making scholarship public, the act of publishing, as a fundamental component of providing access to information, and what kinds of infrastructures we need to put in place in order to collectively support that work. So I think you're very right, Charles, to say that that divide between presses that have come together because of an administrative convenience or a budgetary pressure or some other external force, and those that have come together, let's say, more organically because they see that we have a collective mission, that we have a common goal, and that we can contribute more through putting our professional skills together and building a uniquely combined, evolving skill set that we understand as being necessary to information professional activity, and that is a natural component, an organic component of the development of a library, a scholarly library particularly, that is going to be, I will say, the choice, because it is a choice, I think, that needs to be made. Not one that should be reactive, but that is a more proactive kind of identification of what is the core goal that you have for the unification of the press and the library, for bringing them together into the same kind of administrative structure. and for taking a cold, hard look at your staffing complement across those professional activities, and a willingness to acknowledge their similarities, even though their core qualifications may be different. So I'm just looking down our list here. What I will stress there is, as well, just to close, is that money really matters in this discussion, as much as it is in other ways a distraction. And there, I think it's a question of the functional and symbolic impact of a budget structure. And I would say that that's also the case for an employment group and an employment designation. So those titles do matter. How you understand the work of the press in conjunction with the scholarly communication work of the library as overlapping to an extent that they have more to gain through being combined than they do from being separated. And that is fundamentally the work of the library. Needs to be reflected in the budgetary structure and needs to be reflected in the organizational structure of both the administration and the staff at the library, so that those equivalencies can be allowed to flourish rather than lock people into narrowly defined roles.
Great, thank you, Charles and Lisa. I'm going to talk about Clemson for a little bit. So I'll just introduce myself as someone who has no library degree. I have a PhD in English and English literature and language. We at Clemson tend to talk about, and speaking of sort of equalizing terminology, we recognize that there are a couple of us who don't have library degrees who technically hold the title of an assistant librarian, which is a faculty tenure track appointment. We refer to ourselves as libraries faculty. I like Charles's information professionals because it's yet more equalizing, and I think it even shows, it's an opportunity to take that on board. But I'm in my own role, I'm the director of Clemson University Press, and I'm also library faculty. This is a relatively new development. Clemson University Press until last July was part of the English department. So that administrative structure didn't work for us in lots of ways because we really have grown through a transformative partnership with Liverpool University Press that has allowed us to grow in terms of output and staff and impact and what we can do. And so I was charged by university administration to research reporting structures that made the most sense for our growth and how we want to grow. So it put me in the position of thinking what makes the most sense, how to get those wheels in motion. But that reflection also entailed necessarily thinking about the kind of press that we want to be, the kind of press we want to grow into. There are successful presses, highly successful presses that are operating more like trade presses. They're making their work accessible by producing in volume as much as they can and selling as many copies. The kind of stuff that Clemson is interested in publishing usually tends to serve a more niche market than that, although we do have some more commercial trade publications. But we have been collaborating with the library for quite some time on open access journals and other initiatives. For instance, I had started, the university's DOI agreement, and the press administers that now. But it was only through collaboration with librarians that I was, some of the infrastructure really fell into place in order to allow us to really professionally publish many of the things we were doing. So that seemed where there was the most natural synergy. And I am grateful that my library's colleagues, the faculty, decided to acknowledge the work that I'm doing as a contribution to the core mission of, librarianship, and valued alongside every other form of librarianship. Some practical benefits that gets us, right, from me being faculty, is that I report to the dean. I'm a member of the library's leadership team. I'm also at faculty meetings. I have a voice in faculty hiring. It can contribute to how we are going to grow as a libraries organization as well. The press is growing, but the library is growing too. At least, until we all started working from home, and that's the trajectory we're on, and I'm sticking to it in the long term. And so it's an opportunity to think about how to be involved in those conversations, and for the press to have a voice in those conversations as to how we grow into the institution, but also how the larger Canopy organization grows as well. What does this mean? In practical terms, we can use one really recent example, is that I get to see in real time and be involved in conversations and learn from colleagues about how libraries are responding to a changed ecosystem, a changed information ecosystem, something that is near and dear to the way presses are going to have to operate in working with libraries and in serving those same scholarly communities. How are libraries in this current crisis, prioritizing book, different kinds of purchases and packaging, big deals, small deals. No one knows that better than librarians, right? And so I'm there, and I'm able to sort of get a bit, so in that way it benefits the press. I hope that sometimes in those conversations I can raise a point that helps, bring the perspective of press into the conversation as well. Furthermore, research is incentivized, which means that, in order to stay on, to remain current on trends in libraries, publishing in general, open access, all of these things that are really part and parcel of the enterprise of running a university press now, and serving those greater, university communities and regional communities as a land-grant institution. I'm incentivized to do that as it is part of my portfolio to conduct research and to publish research, which means I make time for it. Frankly, in a small university press with a small but dedicated staff, it would be very easy to make that come off the plate. But it doesn't, and I prioritize it because it is core to my job, which helps keep me current. I think that benefits the press. I hope that benefits the institution. Another unique circumstance, before I move on to just a few obstacles, is that the Clemson is a different kind of institution from any other, well, maybe not from any other, but it's certainly unique from Michigan and from Wilfrid Laurier, and that it was built on a former slave plantation. And Clemson is a university that is coming to recognize that history, try to tell that history accurately. To date, there's been a lot of really commendable initiatives. I've seen diversity office grow hugely under the leadership of a chief diversity officer. There's a lot of signage, there are public events, but books are one way that we can communicate with the larger community about Clemson's history, tell it accurately. And at this moment, of controversy, part of the reason I made the case for a faculty appointment is that I think what I do is essential to the enterprise of academic freedom. And that I wanted to be able to be in a position to advocate for authors, particularly if they're taking up controversial subjects that might relate to memorializing history, to Clemson's history in particular. It's part of our job to tell that story. We have published biographies of Clemson figures, the university biographies, and we'd like to do more of that. We've also collaborated some with special collections. We'd like to continue those collaborations, extend and expand those collaborations. But if I am staff, and I'm in a weaker position to make those kinds of, arguments. And what really, my ear peaked, and why that got on my radar as being absolutely essential to what I do, is that there was a protest in Clemson which resulted in, a lot of change at the institution, of which I'm proud and a lot of others are proud of. But part of the task force recommendation to the Board of Trustees was to reissue books that the press had published, and also to publish several other books on Clemson-related figures, biographies, but that the, quote, final approval of any such biographies is required by the Board of Trustees. So it's an unfunded mandate for the press to, and it sort of clashed with my integrity as a press director and the board to which I report, and who approves our contracts and advises us on our publishing program. So fortunately, I'm working toward having that tenure protection, and I'm surrounded by colleagues who are as committed as I am to academic freedom. Some practical obstacles here is that my attention, in a small but dedicated press environment, my attention is not always focused on running a business. I think that has advantages and disadvantages, but there are times, like for instance, I end up spending time with, daily accounting and things like that, and budgeting, and those kinds of things. But, for instance, marketing initiatives and those kinds of things have been harder to find time for. So as we grow, that's been something where I've had to, rethink some of that, pivot, right? The other thing is that hierarchies exist within presses like anywhere else, and that there are inequalities in terms of professional development funding being guaranteed or prioritized between staff and faculty. And I'm managing editor who's on this call, or in this webinar as well, I think is attending it. She also has a PhD. She has the same classifications I do. She also works with students. She also advises on publishing. She's doing everything that I'm doing that I think constitutes librarianship. And finally, the last sort of, I would consider it an obstacle that is worth considering. It's very localized, but the argument was made by me to make this position a tenure track faculty position, and made the case that my job constellates within the guidelines of Clemson library faculty. There are incredibly talented press directors who don't have a terminal degree. So it means that in order to hire someone to replace me, we would have to find someone who fits those guidelines. And that was something that I was a little bit concerned about going into it. But ultimately, I decided that having representation at all levels of self-governance and leadership made the press, put the press in a stronger position by virtue of the fact that the director is in a stronger position. And that would be true in the future as well. And just as a sort of closing, I'll say that since we are among the presses here represented in the webinar, we are the youngest press, and we're also the most recent to integrate into the libraries. And this first year has been largely about thinking about where are the obstacles, where are the synergies, how can we collaborate, who are our primary, who is really kind of part of our team, who do we need to reach out to more, how can we learn from metadata specialists in order to improve our metadata, how can we work more closely with the person who is running the institutional repository in order to publish more and better, right? How can we really collaborate? Where is there collaboration? Looking ahead to what is expected to be a institutional reorganization within the libraries, right? So we're thinking about how do we fit into the libraries, but also how does the libraries fit with us? And so some of these obstacles, we're very much in the point where this conversation is important, because this broader conversation is important because we're looking ahead to a restructuring. So it's thinking about what are some of these key important questions. And so anyway, I appreciate the conversation because it has very direct and practical application for us moving forward. Anyway, so thanks. That's what we have in terms of the case studies. And I think all of us would be very interested in hearing your thoughts and to draw out some of those broader trends based on your institutions and collaborations with your university presses or other publishing professionals in at your institutions.